Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. What I want to discuss in today's video are what's known as the 5 lower fetters in Buddhism. That's kind of a mouthful, but basically what it is are 5, we might say, mental habits that keep us attached to suffering, attached to dukkha, attached to the world, or in a traditional understanding, attached to the round of rebirths, this beginningless round of rebirths. Now, these fetters come in different, what we might call strengths. That is, some of them are relatively easy to overcome, and others are more difficult. And this is one way that the path of practice in early Buddhism was a path. It was a linear progression, in a way, from a beginner to a very advanced practitioner. And so these fetters were themselves abandoned in stages as we progressed from a beginner to eventually to somebody who was enlightened. That's something to understand from the early material that isn't reflected in some later teachings. Now, most of us, I expect, are on relatively early stages in this path. We're beginners, basically. I would consider myself in that particular category. And as such, the lower fetters are going to be more interesting to us, perhaps. They're more salient, more useful to us to know about, because they're the ones that we really probably have the most issues with. And the higher fetters are going to be somewhat more esoteric to us. I'll discuss those in a future video. Now, I won't be discussing in this video much about the traditional 4 stages of progress along the path. Those sort of go hand in hand with the fetters. I've done a separate video about those, and I'll leave that down in the show notes, a link to that video in case you want to see that. So in any event, overcoming these first 5 fetters doesn't signify that we have attained enlightenment by any means. It simply means that we're farther along. Now, to begin with, these 5 lower fetters come in 2 different flavors, or 2 different strengths, we might say. That is to say, we might say there are 3 fetters that are the absolute lowest. Then there are 2 of these that are sort of intermediate. And so we'll look at the first 3 that are sort of the lowest of the low fetters, the first ones that we have to tackle on our path. We're going to look at those first. It's said that the first 3 of these fetters are sort of overcome at the first of these stages along the path. So what is the first of these fetters? It's known as identity view. The Pali word is Sakaya Ditti, which people say is somewhat hard to translate precisely, but it's usually given a translation something like identity view or self-view or something like that. Basically, identity view is the belief, the view, the opinion that we ourselves are a permanent self in some way. That there is a permanent essence that is who we really are. That there is perhaps even an undying, eternal, or everlasting soul that's within us, that is our essence. This is a view, it's a belief. There are aspects of this relationship to self that are much deeper than simply a viewpoint or an opinion, and those are not discarded, those are not overcome until much, much later along the path, really until enlightenment itself. So this first fetter of identity view is something that, in the scheme of things, is relatively superficial. It's basically something like an intellectual understanding of the self as a permanent soul. And this is a fetter in that it keeps us, this viewpoint, this opinion, keeps us attached to ourselves as permanent beings, expecting ourselves to be unchanging in some way, to be essentially a certain way. And in that way, where this kind of viewpoint can be productive of suffering or dukkha. The second of these lowest fetters is doubt. Now, doubt is basically an uncertainty with the path that we're on, an uncertainty about practice, about Buddhist Dharma. It's the sort of thing that can derail us along the path. If we doubt what we're doing, if we don't really understand it properly, or we don't believe that we understand it properly, that can be a real stumbling block to our progress. And so it's said that if we don't overcome these doubts, they will fetter us to the world, because we will simply leave behind the teaching because of our doubts, and we will remain in bondage, as it were, to the world around us. We'll remain in bondage to our own suffering in a certain respect, because we have not really fully invested ourselves in the practice. Now, traditionally it's said in some suttas that doubts can be overcome in a single instant of a certain kind, a sort of a Dharma eye that's said to open, where we have a glimpse of the final goal. We have a glimpse of nirvana. It's not that we become enlightened by this glimpse, but rather that the glimpse clears up all of our doubts in an instant, basically. That is to say, until we have that glimpse, we have doubts about what we're doing. Once we see that true freedom is possible, once we see that there is a way out from under greed, hatred, and delusion, then we see that the path is effective, or might be effective. Now, that is one way to understand this evaporation of doubts, although it may also be, depending on the person, that doubts simply evaporate on their own in a slower, more methodical kind of way as we continue our practice, until we're at a stage where we simply don't have any really important doubts. Now, I should emphasize here that when I say that doubt is one of these fetters, I don't mean to say that once we've overcome that we have no doubts about anything, or no doubts even about certain aspects of the Dharma. It's simply we don't have any really important doubts, the sort of doubts that would derail us. We may have minor doubts about this, that, the other thing, or frankly doubts about things that have nothing to do with the Dharma, but that's not the point. That's not the fetter that we're getting at when we're talking about these 5 fetters. Now, the third of these 5 lower fetters is what's known as attachment to rules and rituals. There are various translations of this: attachment to rites and rituals, rites and observances. There's different ways of translating the Pali, but basically what it means is that we can become overly invested in our practice, either of following rules, such as the 5 precepts, for example, or in following certain kinds of rituals, whether they be rituals of traditional religion, or rituals that we follow in our daily life, that we believe, in one way or another, lead us to enlightenment. Now, to be clear, following the 5 precepts, following certain kinds of rituals may be useful to us. They may be helpful. That's the reason why the Buddha recommended the 5 precepts, after all. But the 5 precepts are not sufficient. They do not themselves lead to enlightenment. And indeed, if we cling to the 5 precepts, if we invest our ego in those 5 precepts, for example, if we get conceited about the fact that we believe that we're following precepts better than our neighbor, then we've sort of lost the path. We're not really behaving properly, and indeed, we're getting into one of these fetters. We are attaching our sense of self-worth, we're attaching our sense of identity to our practice of a certain thing, and practices alone don't get us to enlightenment. There's more to enlightenment than simply following a rule or a set of rules, or following certain kinds of ritual observances. Now, I should say I've done a past video on this topic, and I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes as well. Now, the last 2 of these 5 lower fetters are significant, to my way of thinking of things, significantly farther along the path, significantly higher up on this ladder of progress. Whereas the first 3 that I've just discussed are more sort of intellectual in flavor. They're more about views, about opinions, beliefs, beliefs about a personal, a permanent self, beliefs about the role of rites and rituals, of rules and observances, about beliefs about doubts. Doubts are the opposite of beliefs. These are all sort of intellectual kinds of things. as we get further along here to these next two, we're getting into our emotional life, more into our emotional life, and that is a much deeper kind of practice, something that takes quite a bit longer to, I think, achieve. Indeed, to me, these last two of the lower fetters are really quite far along indeed. And these are the fetters of sensual desire as number 4, and ill will is number 5. Now, when we think of sensual desire, let's take that one first. Sensual desire is really, for many of us, an inherent part of our ordinary life, where indeed it's what guides us, it's what rules us. What do we want to do? What we want to do are things that bring us pleasures, the kinds of things that bring us sensual pleasures. And so it's our desire for those pleasures that motivates us. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. It's what makes us want to go to our jobs and become wealthy or make a salary so that we can afford these things that give us pleasure. And so the idea of giving up this desire for sense pleasures seems, I think, very foreign to many of us. And what helps is practice. What helps is Buddhist practice. The more that we continue our practice, the more that we begin to understand the downsides of sense pleasures. In particular, one aspect of sense pleasures is what's been called the hedonic treadmill. That is to say, that whenever we see some sense pleasure in front of us that we haven't achieved yet, we think to ourselves at some base level that achieving that is going to make a real difference to our lives. And yet when we get there, we find that there is another pleasure just as far ahead of us, which takes the place of the last one. And so we remain on this kind of treadmill where we feel as though we're always putting effort into walking forward, and yet we remain essentially in the same place as far as our overall happiness goes. In other words, we remain just as happy, just as contented, or really just as unhappy and discontented as we were before. It's just that we've achieved these pleasures along the way. They don't actually lead to any kind of final goal. And so sense desire is the sort of thing that is, to my way of thinking, weakened over a significant period of time during our practice. It's not the sort of thing, at least in my experience, that is let go all in an instant, although maybe you're different, but rather the sort of thing that we begin to see ways of overcoming little by little as we practice. We begin to see more of the dangers. As we see the dangers, we begin to relax around sense desire. And the same is true of ill will, the 5th of these 5 lower fetters. Ill will is another term for, we might call anger, malevolence, hatred, this wish to harm other people or other beings. And I would submit again that many of us think of anger, of hatred, as being a part of our lives, as in fact, many of us think of ill will or anger as being a pleasant kind of experience. I think I was that way before I got into Buddhist practice. Many people sort of spend much of their lives sunk into a general morass of being angry or upset or irritated by the world. And it's true that anger does provide certain kinds of apparent pleasures. In particular, it provides us the apparent pleasure of energy. It can provide energy for us to do things with our lives. We get so angry that we go off and do something, and sometimes that can even be beneficial, although usually the kinds of things that we do out of anger tend to be harmful in the long run. But once again, spending time with Buddhist practice, with meditation, with mindfulness, we begin to see the dangers involved in anger. We begin to see that anger is not a pleasant state to be in, that it's best to relax around anger, to find ways of discharging our anger so that we're not sunk down into it, so that we can see a way forward. so that it can cease to be a fetter on us in the worst way, of keeping us attached to the world and out of a wish to harm the world, basically. Understanding these 5 states, these 5 lower fetters, gives us something of an insight into the path of progress that we find in the early Dharma, in the early path of practice. This idea that we can progress through certain stages by overcoming certain fetters one after the other in a kind of a linear progression. And we see how basically most of these lower fetters are, to an extent, intellectual, at least to a large degree, involving beliefs, views, confusions, doubts that we overcome as we learn the Dharma, as we practice more. And as well, we see that they involve things that are actually quite deep and quite emotional. Learning to first relax around our ordinary tendency to want certain things, certainly certain kinds of pleasant experiences, and on the other hand, our tendency towards ill will, towards anger, and how we can begin to relax around those through our mindfulness practice, through living a certain kind of practical life. As we overcome these, we move farther along the path, which gets us to the next 5 fetters, known as the 5 higher fetters, which I've said are somewhat more esoteric than the lower ones. And in my next video, what I want to do is to go into those. And so I'll leave a link to that video up on the screen when it's ready to view. Meanwhile, if you're getting something out of this discussion of mine, please consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked here and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.